Do you think the worst part of a divorce is fighting over assets? No. The true nightmare is when the man who shared my bed staged a flawless play to lock me in a psychiatric ward, destroy my career, and steal the only living soul I cherished. Brace yourself. The secret audio recording played at the final minute of my trial exposed a plot so malicious that even an iron-fisted judge was left completely speechless. Hello, dear listeners of Violet Revenge Stories. We sincerely appreciate your continuous presence and support, but unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving us entirely without the necessary budget to operate. If you find today's story captivating, please politely consider supporting us with just $1 so we can afford to pay our dedicated staff, allowing them to comfortably cover their living expenses and continue creating these incredible narratives for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the direct donation link located in the video description or the pinned comment section. My name is Lillian Watson. I am 32 years old, and this is the story of the day I was dragged into absolute hell. Courtroom number 12 of the King County Courthouse in Seattle did not feel like a hall of justice. It felt exactly like a tomb. The air was frigid, pumped relentlessly through ancient overhead vents that hissed a constant, agonizing rhythm into the silence. A heavy, sickening scent of industrial bleach and lemon floor wax clung tightly to every single surface. The smell was meant to signify cleanliness and order, but to me, it smelled like a sterile antiseptic chamber preparing for a surgical execution. The grand mahogany wall panels and the towering high ceilings only amplified the severely oppressive atmosphere, pressing down heavily on my chest and turning the room into an invisible, suffocating dungeon. I could barely draw a breath without feeling the sheer, crushing weight of the space attempting to collapse my lungs. I sat entirely motionless at the heavy wooden defendant's table. Every muscle in my body was locked tightly in a state of petrified, aching rigor. My once vibrant blonde hair now hung in limp, lifeless strands across my face, acting as a desperate, fragile curtain to hide my violently dark-circled eyes from the predatory gazes burning into my back. I kept my hands buried deep in my lap, my fingers gripping the coarse fabric of my black dress with terrifying force. I squeezed the material so fiercely that my knuckles turned stark, bone white under the strain, the rough seams pressing hard into the pads of my fingers. I needed the harsh, grounding friction of the heavy cloth against my skin. It was the absolute only physical anchor keeping me tethered to reality, the only intense sensation strong enough to suppress the violent, humiliating tremors threatening to shatter my remaining composure. Then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Julian Vance walked in. He was a celebrated millionaire, a nationally renowned motivational speaker, and the deeply sadistic man who had spent the last half-decade systematically destroying my sanity behind closed doors. He looked absolutely radiant, wrapped impeccably in a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders. He moved down the aisle with the effortless, floating grace of a living saint. His grooming was immaculate, his posture exuding a charismatic, infectious warmth that had effortlessly charmed millions of people through television screens and on grand corporate stages, to the jury, to the wide-eyed spectators, and likely to the court staff. He was a blinding beacon of inspiration and success. Only I knew the absolute, decaying rot hiding beneath that polished, blindingly perfect exterior. Julian paused elegantly before taking his seat at the plaintiff's table. He leaned over to his cunning, high-priced attorney, whispering something quiet that made them both share a triumphant, sickening smile. Then, Julian slowly turned his head, his eyes locked directly onto mine, the public. Saintly warmth vanished entirely from his expression in a fraction of a second, replaced by a gaze so cold, so hollow, and so utterly devoid of human empathy that it made my blood run like ice water. It was the exact, calculated, unblinking stare of an apex predator observing a fully exhausted, cornered prey right before the final, fatal strike. He knew I was broken. He was here today merely to sweep up the remaining dust. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room was violently shattered by a deafening crack. Judge Marcus Thorne, a man universally feared for his draconian strictness and possessing well over 30 years of relentless, unyielding experience on the bench, struck his heavy wooden gavel with terrifying force. "Court is now in session," he commanded. His voice was a booming, authoritative thunderclap that reverberated aggressively off the wooden walls, demanding absolute, unquestioning submission from every single person present. He adjusted his glasses, peering down at us from his elevated bench like a stern, unforgiving God ready to cast harsh judgment on the unworthy. The very moment the echo of the gavel faded into the ceiling, Julian's lawyer sprang to his feet with the aggressive, coiled energy of a striking viper. He did not waste a single breath on courtroom pleasantries. In a loud, razor-sharp voice that cut through the chilled air, he immediately laid out their calculated, devastating demands to the court. He formally requested the immediate and total stripping of all my foundational shares in the company, erasing my years of relentless hard work in a single sentence. He aggressively demanded the court order my immediate eviction from our sprawling shared mansion, aiming to leave me absolutely destitute with nothing but the clothes on my back. But the final demand was the one precisely designed to kill my soul. He loudly petitioned for the absolute, unquestionable ownership of my rescue dog. Max? Julian despised that dog. He hated the shedding hair. He hated the noise, and he hated the expense. But Julian knew with absolute, chilling certainty that Max was the only living, breathing creature left in this dark world that I still considered family. Taking my money was just business. Throwing me out onto the cold streets of Seattle was merely a strategic financial move to him, but taking Max was his final, deliberate act of pure, unadulterated psychological slaughter. I squeezed my bleeding hands tighter in my lap, praying silently to a God I wasn't sure was listening, begging for just enough strength to survive the absolute nightmare that was about to unfold. The bailiff called Julian to the witness stand. Watching him rise from his chair was like watching a masterclass in theatrical deception. The sharp, predatory energy he had radiated just moments before vanished entirely. As he walked toward the front of the courtroom, his broad shoulders noticeably slumped. His usually confident, brisk stride slowed to a hesitant, burdened shuffle. He looked like a man carrying the unbearable weight of a profound personal tragedy. By the time he raised his right hand to swear on the Bible, his face was a portrait of profound exhaustion and reluctant sorrow. It was a flawless, Oscar-worthy performance designed to manipulate every single person in the room. When his attorney began the questioning, Julian answered with a voice I barely recognized. His signature warm, booming baritone, the voice that commanded massive auditoriums across the country, was gone. In its place was a fragile, trembling whisper. He painted a masterful, devastating picture of our marriage, carefully positioning himself as the helpless, loving husband, desperately trying to save a wife who was rapidly spiraling into total madness. He told the court that I was a high-functioning alcoholic whose addiction had completely taken over our private lives. He spoke with sickeningly practiced grief about my supposed mental instability, claiming that the immense pressure from my corporate job had fractured my grip on reality, leaving me suffering from severe, dangerous paranoia. He did not sound angry. That was the most infuriating part. He sounded utterly heartbroken, wiping away imaginary tears as he described how he had allegedly spent years trying to get me the psychiatric help I desperately needed, only for me to viciously reject his support every single time. It was a beautifully spun web of complete fiction, delivered without a single blink of hesitation. To cement this monstrous lie, his lawyer dramatically produced an official document from his leather briefcase and handed it up to the bench. It was the police report from the night of August 10th. The attorney read specific excerpts aloud, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. ensuring the jury heard every damning detail. The report officially documented a scene of absolute chaos. It described finding me in the center of our ruined living room, completely hysterical, screaming at the top of my lungs, surrounded by a terrifying sea of broken glass and shattered wood. Julian leaned into the microphone, his voice cracking with artificial emotion as he recounted his version of that horrific night. He choked back a fake sob, telling the judge that I had suffered a massive manic episode. According to his fabricated story, I had flown into a violent, uncontrollable rage and deliberately taken a heavy brass lamp to his prized collection of antique acoustic guitars. He described the destruction in agonizing detail, claiming I had smashed instruments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars into unrecognizable splinters with my own bare hands. But he did not stop there. He lowered his head, staring at his hands in his lap, and whispered that after destroying his most cherished possessions, I had looked him dead in the eyes and threatened to douse the entire house in gasoline and burn it to the ground with him inside it. I was terrified. "Your Honor," Julian murmured, looking up at Judge Thorne with wide, pleading eyes. Not just for my own life, but for hers. She was completely out of her mind. His attorney smoothly transitioned to the financial demands, asking Julian to explain why he was seeking total control of all our marital assets and asking the court to remove me from our home. Julian sat up slightly straighter, adopting the noble posture of a tragic hero making an impossible sacrifice. He asserted that taking everything away from me was not an act of malice or greed, but rather an extreme, necessary measure of self-defense. Furthermore, he claimed it was the only way to save my life. He stated, with a straight face, that if I were allowed to walk away with my millions of dollars in corporate shares and cash, I would immediately use that massive fortune to purchase illegal stimulants and alcohol, funding a lethal binge that would inevitably end in my own tragic death. Taking my home and my money, he argued, was his final, desperate act of love to stop me from destroying myself entirely. The sheer logic and horrifying perfection of his woven narrative settled heavily over the courtroom. It was airtight. He had the calm demeanor of a saint, the tragic story of a victim, and the official police report to back up every single venomous word. I watched in paralyzed horror as the atmosphere in the room visibly shifted. The members of the jury leaned forward, their faces softening with profound sympathy for the millionaire who had seemingly endured years of silent torture. Even Judge Thorne, a man known for his impenetrable stoicism, visibly relaxed his rigid posture, his eyes reflecting a clear, unmistakable pity for Julian. Then, the judge and the jury slowly turned their heads toward the defense table. Their expressions hardened instantly. The collective gaze of the entire courtroom bore down on me, heavy with judgment, disgust, and complete condemnation. Julian had successfully painted me as a violent, deranged monster, and looking at the hostile faces surrounding me, I knew that every single person in that room believed him unconditionally. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to block out the suffocating, judgmental stares burning into my skin from every corner of the courtroom. Behind my closed eyelids, the pristine walls of justice faded away entirely, replaced instantly by the suffocating, pitch-black darkness of the last 5 years of my life. To the outside world, our marriage was the ultimate modern fairy tale, a glossy magazine cover of wealth, philanthropy, and flawless success. But behind the heavy oak doors of our sprawling estate, I was not a wife. I was a prisoner living in a meticulously constructed, inescapable psychological slaughterhouse. Julian never once raised a hand to strike me. He was far too smart for that. Physical bruises heal, and more importantly, to a man deeply obsessed with his public image, physical bruises can be photographed and used as undeniable evidence in a court of law. His violence was entirely invisible, a creeping, insidious poison specifically designed to rot my mind from the inside out and strip away my grip on reality. He used his immense wealth and his overwhelming, charismatic influence to systematically sever every single lifeline I had to the outside world. Close friends were slowly alienated through his subtle, continuous manipulations and whispered lies. Family members were driven away by carefully orchestrated arguments that he always managed to blame on my supposed mood swings. He did not stop until I was stranded entirely alone on an isolated island of his own making. He then transformed our shared mansion into a high-tech panopticon. Every single hallway, every room, and every hidden corner was monitored by a vast, intricate network of security cameras that he controlled directly from his smartphone. I could not breathe, I could not weep, and I could not even pace the floor without him watching my every move. But far worse than the constant, crushing surveillance was the artificial chemical fog he forced me to live in. I had struggled with mild insomnia due to the demands of my career, but he had graciously offered to take charge of picking up my medication. I did not know until it was almost too late that he had been systematically tampering with my prescriptions, secretly replacing my standard sleeping aids with heavy, mind-numbing tranquilizers for years. I drifted through the sprawling rooms of my own home in a perpetual, agonizing daze. My thoughts were constantly swimming in a thick, narcotic syrup that made it nearly impossible to string together a coherent sentence, let alone summon the immense cognitive strength required to mount an escape from his control. His absolute favorite game was the calculated manipulation of my reality, a relentless daily campaign of gaslighting designed to convince me that my brain was fundamentally broken. I would leave a crucial corporate file on my home office desk, only to find it completely missing hours later when I needed it for a meeting. My house keys, my mobile phone, vital financial documents, they would vanish into thin air, only to mysteriously reappear days later in the most bizarre, illogical places, like the back of the refrigerator or buried at the bottom of a laundry basket. Sometimes, he would deliberately break expensive household items, a shattered antique vase or a ruined kitchen appliance, and leave the sharp, jagged pieces scattered on the floor for me to discover, when I would inevitably panic, frantically tearing the house apart, searching for lost items, or staring in deep, trembling confusion at the unexplained damage. He would magically appear at my side. He would wrap his strong arms around my shaking shoulders, his voice dripping with a synthetic, sickeningly sweet tenderness. "You are working yourself to death, my love," he would whisper softly into my ear, gently stroking my hair as if calming a deeply frightened, mentally deficient child. "The extreme pressure at Auratech Synergies is completely destroying your memory and your nerves. You are so stressed. You do not even remember what you are doing in your own home anymore. You just need to rest. Let me take over. Let me take care of everything for you." He repeated this identical script so often, and with such convincing, sorrowful empathy, that I truly began to believe I was losing my mind. I genuinely thought the intense, daily demands of my executive position at the tech conglomerate were causing some form of early-onset dementia. I did not realize he was slowly, deliberately laying the groundwork to have me legally committed, but the thick chemical fog broke slightly during the late summer. I found a rare moment of absolute clarity, just long enough to realize that I was in imminent, mortal danger, terrified for my life. I began secretly skimming small amounts of cash from my personal accounts, painstakingly setting up a hidden, untraceable divorce fund. I desperately needed a way out, a secret escape hatch. I thought I was being exceptionally careful. I thought I had finally outsmarted him, but Julian saw everything. The absolute truth about the night of August 10th was a visceral nightmare that still paralyzes my lungs every time I close my eyes. He had somehow found the hidden account statements. When I walked into the dimly lit living room that evening, the mask of the loving, deeply concerned husband was entirely gone. In its place stood a monster of pure, unadulterated malice. He aggressively cornered me against the heavy stone fireplace, his large physical presence looming over me like a suffocating, inescapable shadow. He did not scream. He did not yell. He simply smiled down at me. It was a cold, dead, reptilian smile that promised my absolute, total destruction. Then, maintaining unbroken, terrifying eye contact with me. He calmly walked over to his prized display of antique acoustic guitars. These were instruments he publicly claimed to love more than anything in the world. Rare pieces worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, with a look of pure, calculated psychotic joy illuminating his face. He picked up the heaviest wooden body and smashed it violently against the solid brick wall. He grabbed another, and then another, destroying his own cherished collection with a terrifying, rhythmic, and deafening brutality. Shards of polished wood and snapping steel strings flew dangerously across the room, raining down around my head while I cowered on the hardwood floor, weeping in pure, paralyzed terror. He was not just destroying his guitars, he was providing a violent, graphic demonstration of exactly what he was going to do to my life. When the floor was entirely covered in a thick layer of jagged splinters and broken wood, he pulled his mobile phone from his tailored pocket and dialed emergency services. The psychological transformation I witnessed in that split second was instantaneous and utterly sickening. He dropped heavily to his knees in the center of the wreckage, burying his face in his hands. The moment the emergency dispatcher answered the call, he began to sob hysterically. He loudly begged for them to hurry, screaming through fake tears that his wife had gone completely insane, that I was violently tearing the house apart, and that he feared for his very life. When the police officers burst through our front door just minutes later, they found exactly what Julian wanted them to find. They found a brilliant, generous, philanthropic millionaire weeping helplessly in the ruins of his most prized possessions, and they found me, huddled pathetically in the corner, trembling so violently I could not even stand up. The lingering tranquilizers in my system, combined with the pure primal shock of the horrific psychological assault I had just endured, rendered me entirely mute. I opened my mouth to desperately defend myself, to scream the truth to the officers, but no sound came out. I just choked silently on my own rising panic. The officers looked down at my dilated pupils, my uncontrollable physical shaking, and the surrounding destruction. And they believed his meticulously crafted narrative without a single, fleeting shadow of a doubt. They treated me not as a traumatized victim, but as a highly dangerous, unpredictable, and unstable threat. I snapped my eyes open, the sterile, blinding fluorescent lights of the courtroom violently yanking me back to the horrific present. My heart was slamming against my ribs in cold, agonizing thuds that vibrated painfully all the way up into my dry throat. The faces of the jury members were still actively staring at me, their eyes filled with the exact same misplaced pity for Julian and profound disgust for me that the responding police officers had shown on that terrible night. The chilling, undeniable reality of my current situation settled heavily over me like a suffocating lead blanket. I knew with absolute certainty that if my legal team failed to miraculously expose the truth today, Julian would win everything. He would legally drain my bank accounts. He would forcefully mandate my permanent committal to a psychiatric facility exactly as he had promised. And he would take Max. He would take the only living thing that had offered me pure, unconditional love during my darkest hours. And I knew he would likely destroy my sweet dog just as easily and thoughtlessly as he had destroyed those guitars. This was no longer just a legal battle for my financial assets. It was a desperate, bloody, and final fight for my absolute survival. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted the very moment Evelyn Reed pushed back her heavy wooden chair. My attorney was a woman of remarkably slight stature, standing perhaps 5 feet 2 inches in her sensible, low-heeled shoes, yet she commanded the physical space of a towering, intimidating giant, while Julian's highly paid legal counsel had relied heavily on grand theatrical gestures, booming rhetoric, and thick leather binders overflowing with meticulously fabricated evidence. Evelyn carried absolutely nothing. She stepped out from behind our desk and slowly approached the wooden podium with her hands completely empty. Her posture was perfectly straight, her chin held high, and her piercing gray eyes fixed directly on the man sitting comfortably in the witness box. Those eyes were undoubtedly her most terrifying weapon. They were as sharp, cold, and unforgiving as freshly honed razor blades, capable of dissecting a complex lie before it even fully left a hostile witness's mouth. "Mr. Vance," Evelyn began, her voice exceptionally calm, steady, and conversational. It was completely devoid of the loud aggression one might typically expect during a high-stakes cross-examination. "I want to ensure this court has absolute, crystal-clear comprehension of the specific timeline you just presented regarding the evening of August 10th. Julian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the polished wooden rail of the witness stand. He was still brilliantly playing the role of the heartbroken, exhausted husband, but a microscopic, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the very corner of his mouth. He felt entirely untouchable. He confidently adjusted the cuffs of his expensive custom shirt, preparing himself to casually deliver the final, devastating nail into my coffin. "I am more than happy to clarify anything you need, Ms. Reed," Julian replied softly, glancing tragically toward the jury box to ensure they were absorbing his manufactured grief. "Though reliving that horrific night is quite difficult for me, I am sure it is a profound burden," Evelyn noted dryly, her face an unreadable mask of polite, icy indifference. "Let us focus specifically on the physical destruction of your highly valuable property. You are stating today, under the absolute penalty of perjury, that your wife, acting completely alone and in a state of severe, alcohol-induced psychosis, took a heavy brass object and systematically smashed every single one of your antique instruments to pieces. Is that your definitive, sworn testimony?" Julian did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He nodded his head with an expression of grave, undeniable certainty. "Yes, that is exactly what happened. She was completely out of her mind and violently out of control." He was incredibly confident in his lie because he knew a dark secret that the court did not yet understand. Hours before the police sirens ever echoed through our neighborhood that night, Julian had personally walked through the entire estate and manually unplugged the main power supply to our comprehensive, state-of-the-art security camera system. He had personally severed the hard drives from their automated cloud backup servers. He knew with absolute mathematical certainty that there was zero video evidence in existence to contradict his flawless, tragic story. To his mind, it was simply his respected word against the word of a woman he had already successfully painted as a deranged, heavily medicated lunatic. Evelyn held his arrogant gaze for a long, intensely heavy moment. She did not raise her voice to accuse him of perjury. She did not aggressively pound her fist on the podium. Instead, she executed a legal maneuver so abrupt and logically disorienting that it caused a physical ripple of confusion to spread throughout the quiet courtroom. "Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, her tone suddenly shifting from polite inquiry to cold, calculated, and razor-sharp precision. "Are you intimately familiar with the specific, highly classified projects currently in active development at Auratech Synergies, the multinational technology conglomerate where your wife currently holds her executive position?" The question hung in the chilled courtroom air, seemingly entirely disconnected from the violent domestic dispute they had just been fiercely debating. The members of the jury frowned in deep confusion. For a split second, Julian blinked rapidly, his carefully constructed mask of sorrow slipping just enough to reveal genuine, unfiltered bewilderment. Before he could even open his mouth to formulate an answer, his attorney sprang up from the plaintiff's table like a coiled spring snapping violently loose. "Objection, Your Honor," the lawyer barked loudly, his face flushing a deep, angry red with sudden, defensive panic. "This line of questioning is wildly inappropriate and completely lacks any factual relevance. We are here today to discuss a severe domestic incident and the necessary division of marital assets, not to explore the proprietary business secrets of a random tech company. Opposing counsel is purposefully wasting the court's valuable time with this fishing expedition." Judge Thorne leaned forward heavily over his high mahogany bench, his thick gray eyebrows knitting together in deep concentration. He looked down at Evelyn, his stern expression silently demanding a compelling explanation for this bizarre, seemingly random pivot. "Your Honor," Evelyn countered smoothly, absolutely refusing to break her intense, predatory eye contact with Julian. I assure this court that the defendant's specific developmental work at Auratech Synergies is not only relevant, it is the absolute, undeniable linchpin of this entire case. The answer to my question will directly and immediately illuminate the true events of August 10th. I respectfully request some extremely brief latitude to establish this vital, undeniable connection. Judge Thorne studied Evelyn's unwavering, confident expression for several tense, silent seconds. He was a strict judge who openly despised cheap theatrical tricks, but his decades of experience allowed him to recognize a brilliant lawyer who possessed a lethal, game-changing ace up her sleeve. He slowly raised his hand, instantly silencing Julian's panicked attorney. "The objection is overruled," Judge Thorne declared, his booming voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I will allow the question, Ms. Reed, but you are on a very short leash. Make your connection quickly. The witness is ordered to answer the question." Julian let out a long, heavy, and highly theatrical sigh, dramatically rolling his eyes toward the ceiling as if he were being forced to indulge a deeply foolish, annoying child. The raw, toxic arrogance he had kept so carefully hidden from the jury all morning finally began to bleed through his meticulously crafted facade. He leaned back aggressively in the wooden witness chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest in a posture of supreme, mocking dismissal. "No, Ms. Reed, I do not know anything at all about her secret little projects," Julian answered, his deep voice dripping with unmistakable sarcasm and dripping contempt. "I am a working philanthropist and a public speaker. I deal with helping actual human beings. I frankly never cared about whatever meaningless tech nonsense my wife was supposedly developing in her little corporate office." He smiled a wide, venomous, and a highly satisfied smile, completely and utterly oblivious to the terrifying fact that the jagged jaws of an inescapable steel trap had just slammed entirely shut around his throat. Evelyn's cold smile was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was a genuine, terrifying expression of absolute legal checkmate. She slowly turned away from the trapped man on the stand and faced the high bench. "Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to formally submit into the official court record Exhibit Number 28. It is a highly complex, deeply encrypted data file containing comprehensive 360-degree audio and advanced spatial mapping information." She raised her hand, signaling to the bailiff. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the room opened, and two court technicians quickly rolled a massive high-definition monitor into the exact center of the courtroom, connecting it directly to Evelyn's secure terminal. "To fully understand the gravity of this undeniable evidence," Evelyn continued, her voice ringing out clearly across the utterly silent room, "you must understand the exact nature of what my client actually does at Auratech Synergies. They are not merely developing meaningless tech nonsense, as Mr. Vance so eloquently and dismissively put it just moments ago. They are currently in the final beta testing phases of a revolutionary, highly classified prototype known as a spatial mapping virtual assistant. It is an advanced artificial intelligence program designed specifically to analyze complex acoustic environments, map physical movements in real time using sonar bouncing, and record encrypted behavioral data. On the evening of August 10th, my client had this exact software running actively in the background on her open company laptop, which was sitting directly on the desk in their shared living room. Julian's lawyer instantly sprang to his feet, his face pale with sudden, blinding panic. "Objection, Your Honor. This is unverified, highly experimental technology. We have had absolutely no time to review this so-called digital evidence." Judge Thorne slammed his gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. "Overruled. You opened the door to this entire timeline, Counselor. You will sit down and remain completely silent while the defense presents its exhibit." Evelyn turned back to Julian. The arrogant, untouchable glow had entirely vanished from his face, replaced by the gray, sickly pallor of a man realizing he had just stepped onto a live landmine. "Mr. Vance, you are an incredibly thorough and calculating man," Evelyn stated, her voice dripping with lethal precision. We do not dispute for a single second that you manually severed the main power grid to your entire home security system that night. You believed you were operating in total, undetectable darkness. However, what you entirely failed to comprehend in your supreme arrogance was that a standard corporate laptop operates on an independent, internal lithium battery. When the house abruptly plunged into darkness, the Auratech software did not shut down. It merely switched seamlessly to its secondary power source. The artificial intelligence utilized the laptop's advanced multi-directional microphone arrays and spatial sensors to automatically document, record, and reconstruct the precise physical movements, the exact trajectory of flying objects, and the complete, unedited audio of the entire violent confrontation in that room. The courtroom was dead silent. You could practically hear the collective heartbeat of the jury members accelerating. Julian gripped the solid wooden rail of the witness stand so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white. He looked completely paralyzed. Evelyn firmly pressed a single button on her remote control. The massive screen in the center of the room instantly flickered to brilliant life. For a brief fraction of a second, there was only the soft hiss of digital static. Then, the crisp, undeniable, and deeply menacing boom of Julian's real voice violently shattered the quiet space. It was not the fragile, trembling whisper he had used on the stand all morning. It was the vicious, arrogant, and monstrous roar of a domestic tyrant. "You actually think you can leave me, Lillian?" The recorded voice snarled through the high-fidelity speakers. The audio was so crystal clear and aggressive that it felt as if he were standing directly next to the jury box. "You think you can just pack a bag and walk away with my money? Let us see who the police believe. Let us see if they trust a highly respected, philanthropic billionaire or a screaming, drugged-out lunatic who is actively destroying her own home." A collective, horrified gasp echoed loudly from the public gallery. Several jury members physically recoiled in their leather chairs, their wide eyes darting rapidly from the massive screen to the frozen man sitting trapped in the witness box. But the nightmare was far from over. The screen abruptly shifted from a plain black background to a complex, three-dimensional wireframe representation of our sprawling living room. It was a high contrast, digital rendering of the spatial data, mapping the exact dimensions of the walls and furniture. Two distinct, glowing human silhouettes appeared clearly on the display. The smaller figure was crouched defensively, trembling in the far corner. The larger, aggressively imposing figure, mathematically proven by the software to match Julian's exact height and shoulder width, marched furiously across the room. The entire courtroom watched in absolute, breathless horror as the digital ghost of Julian Vance grabbed the geometric shape of a guitar from the wall display. The terrifying, agonizing sound of heavy wood smashing violently against solid brick blasted through the courtroom speakers, crack after crack after crack. The artificial intelligence flawlessly synchronized the violent, destructive audio with the graphic representation of the larger figure rhythmically and intentionally destroying the objects against the wall. It was a flawless digital reenactment of pure, unadulterated domestic terrorism. The recording then captured the exact, sickening moment Julian dialed emergency services. The jury watched the digital figure drop heavily to its knees amidst the calculated wreckage. They heard the instantaneous, psychotic shift in his vocal tone. The vicious, roaring predator vanished in a microsecond, instantly replaced by the sobbing, terrified victim begging the dispatcher for immediate help. The absolute hypocrisy was so raw, so blatantly exposed, that it made the very air in the room feel physically toxic. Yet, Evelyn had saved the absolute most devastating blow for the very end. She refused to stop the playback. After he hung up the phone with the emergency dispatcher, Evelyn announced loudly, her voice cutting sharply through the heavy tension gripping the room. He had precisely 4 minutes before the Seattle patrol cars arrived at the front gates. He used that brief window of time to make one final, personal phone call. The audio crackled once again. The sharp sound of a ringing line echoed through the speakers, followed closely by a woman's breathless voice answering, "It was not me. It was Camille." It was his longtime, heavily guarded secret mistress. Julian's recorded voice drifted through the stunned courtroom, completely stripped of any fake tears or panic. He sounded deeply euphoric, letting out a cold, breathless, and purely sadistic burst of laughter. "It is done, baby." Julian chuckled through the speakers, his tone dripping with triumphant malice. "She fell for it completely. The police are on their way right now. I am going to throw that worthless bitch into a mental asylum permanently. And the absolute best part? I am taking the dog, too. I will make sure she suffers to death in a padded cell while I legally take every single dime." The recording ended with a sharp, final digital click. The massive screen went totally black. The explosive, undeniable revelation hit the courtroom like a massive physical shockwave, completely and utterly obliterating every single lie Julian Vance had meticulously constructed over the last 5 years in a matter of minutes. The heavy silence that followed the abrupt end of the recording was absolute and suffocating. It was not the quiet of a calm room. It was the paralyzed, breathless silence of a sudden, catastrophic execution. Every single eye in courtroom number 12 was violently ripped away from the blackened monitor and pinned directly onto Julian Vance. The invincible, golden aura of the philanthropic millionaire had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic shell. The skin on his face had drained of all color, turning a sickening, waxy gray that closely resembled a fresh corpse. His hands, previously steepled in a display of supreme arrogance, were now shaking uncontrollably, his white knuckles gripping the edges of the wooden witness chair as if he were dangling over a bottomless cliff. Even his own high-priced defense attorney physically distanced himself from the wreckage. The cunning lawyer took a slow, deliberate step backward, completely abandoning his client at the stand. His mouth hung slightly open, utterly speechless, realizing in real time that his own legal career was now dangerously close to being dragged into a massive criminal conspiracy. The paralyzing spell was violently broken by the deafening, explosive crack of wood striking wood. Judge Marcus Thorne brought his heavy gavel down with such tremendous, unrestrained physical force that the sharp sound echoed like cannon fire against the solid oak walls. The judge slowly removed his silver wire-frame glasses. His normally stoic, impassive face was flushed a deep, furious crimson. He was a man who had dedicated over 3 decades of his life to the absolute sanctity of the law, and he had just been forced to listen to a wealthy predator mock the entire judicial system. "Mr. Buff," Judge Thorne growled, his deep voice shaking with an intense, unbridled rage that made the court reporter flinch. "In all my years sitting on this bench, I have rarely witnessed such a disgusting, calculated, and purely evil manipulation of justice. You came into my courtroom, placed your hand on a holy book, and attempted to legally murder this woman's future using a fabricated narrative of pure fiction." Julian opened his mouth, desperately trying to summon his famous charm, but only a pathetic, dry rasp emerged. "Do not speak," the judge roared, slamming the gavel down a second time. "I am absolutely done listening to your poison. Based on the irrefutable, undeniable evidence presented by the defense, I am immediately dismissing every single one of the plaintiff's demands with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am hereby granting full, uncontested ownership of all marital properties, every single corporate share, and total financial assets directly to Lillian Watson." I let out a shaky breath I did not know I was holding, but the judge was not finished. "And regarding the rescue dog, Max," Judge Thorne continued, his eyes narrowing into cold, unforgiving slits as he glared at Julian, "full and permanent custody is immediately awarded to Ms. Watson if you so much as look in the direction of that animal, or if you come within 1 mile of Ms. Watson's physical presence at any time. I will personally see to it that you are thrown into a concrete cell. To ensure you understand the severity of your actions, you are also ordered to pay 100% of all legal fees and court costs associated with this entire sham proceeding." A wave of pure, intoxicating relief washed over my body, washing away 5 years of terror and psychological torture. But the true climax, The final strike of absolute justice was yet to come. Judge Thorne leaned forward, pointing a single, accusatory finger directly at the trembling man in the witness box. This civil matter is concluded. However, your legal nightmare is just beginning. I am officially seizing Exhibit 28 and transferring this recording directly to the King County Prosecutor's Office today. I am filing an urgent, formal recommendation for your immediate criminal indictment on multiple felony charges, including severe perjury, the deliberate staging of a crime scene, and the gross obstruction of justice. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic whispers, but all I could hear was the beautiful, rhythmic thumping of my own healing heart. I turned entirely away from the monster who had tried to destroy me. I threw my arms around Evelyn Reed, pulling the brilliant, fearless lawyer into a crushing embrace as hot, unrestrained tears of pure happiness finally spilled freely down my cheeks. She hugged me back tightly, her sharp eyes softening into a warm, victorious smile. I did not bother to look back at Julian Vance as I gathered my coat. I kept my chin raised high, my shoulders pulled back, and walked down the center aisle with the steady, unbroken grace of a woman who had just conquered hell. As I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the brilliant, blinding sunshine of the Seattle afternoon, I heard the single most beautiful sound in the world echoing from the courtroom behind me. It was the sharp, cold, and unmistakable metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping violently shut around the wrists of the man who had once proudly declared himself the absolute lord of my life. Thank you so sincerely for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's journey compelling and want to support our channel, please politely consider donating just $1. Your generous support allows us to pay our incredibly hard-working staff, helping them feed their families and empowering them to continue creating more amazing, high-quality stories for you to enjoy. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the direct donation link provided in the video description or the pinned comments section.